By the way, I really loved that montage, that video in the beginning. Started a long time ago, the wheel and the arrow, and got more and more and more advanced technologically, but it didn't really come all the way to the present, because it should have climaxed with a Samsung Note 7 igniting and burning down your apartment, which is something I would like to talk about. I'd like to dial out even further than Derek did and talk about technology in general. Excuse me, we're all having a wonderful time with this. There, I think I got it. I think I do. And I'd like to talk about, from a Christian perspective, of course, I'm a Christian minister. Technology, good or bad? Absolutely. And here are the reasons why. Number one, now let's start with the good. Technology is actually commanded to the human race by the Bible. The Bible commands human race to use technology. You say, what? Well, Genesis 1 and 2, which is the beginning of the Bible, in which it describes the creation, and you might say the commissioning of the human race by God. And Genesis 1:28 says, God creates the human race and says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Now that word subdue has created some concern with people. It's a word that means to rule, it means to control. And that sounds a little negative, like you're supposed to subdue the earth. What's that mean? But as almost all literary critics and biblical commentators say, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are both creation stories. They're basically a recapitulation. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 both recapitulate the Genesis story, the creation story. They're kind of parallels, a little bit like the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they tell the story twice. And in the second story, Genesis 2, the parallel passage to God telling the human race what the human race should be doing, there in Genesis 2:15 he says, what you need to be doing is work the ground and care for it. In other words, the parallel passage in Genesis 2, we're told that Adam and Eve were put into a garden, and Adam and Eve were told to work the ground and take care of it. And what is that? That's agriculture. What is that? That's technology. See, if you just wait for the ground to grow food without touching the ground, without doing anything to it, you can definitely find something to eat. You go out in the wilderness and you can scrounge and you can find food. But as soon as you plow it and plant it, then the situation is you're using technologies on the ground, and the ground, in a sense, its potential to produce food is unleashed. Or you could say it's made more efficient. You're making your ground a more efficient producer of food, and it had the potentiality in it, and only technology was able to release that technology. So, to release that potentiality. So not leaving nature as it is, but applying technology to it to unleash and to achieve potential more efficiently than you would without technology. That's something that actually God, to start with, said the human race you should do. Cultivate the riches of creation. Draw out all the potentialities that God put into creation using technology. So, okay, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is not in the technology, it's in us. And without getting into too much detail, as soon as you get to Genesis 4, after the human race has turned away from God and essentially set itself up, human beings, according to the Bible, the problems of this world are there because human beings put themselves in the place of God or put other things in the place of God. And therefore, you have almost immediately the Cain and Abel story, Cain murdering Abel. And then Cain has children, and one of his descendants is Lamech. And Lamech has two grandsons. One is Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. One is Jabal, who makes advances in animal husbandry. In other words, the Cainites are producing technology, but they're also violent. And Lamech said to his wives, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. In other words, if you bruise my elbow, I'll take your head off. And Genesis 4 describes increasing technology, but used for violence and used for exploitation, which means technology, a good thing, obviously, in itself, can be used actually not to bring about more human good, but as a weapon against human good. So that's the problem. And how is it a problem? Now I would like to turn, as David already mentioned, to a philosopher we talked about last year, if you were here, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor in 1991 did the Massey lectures, and the Massey lectures are at University of Toronto. And the lectures were called The Malaise of Modernity, the malaises of modernity. Malaise, of course, means uneasiness, a sense of sickness, a sense there's something wrong, hard to put your finger on it. And one of the three malaises of modern secular life is what he calls instrumental reason or technology. And he says one of the problems that many people perceive in our modern secular world is that technology is creating problems. Now, he starts off by saying there's the boosters and the knockers of technology. The boosters of technology say that this is the way to solve human problems. Technology is going to solve poverty. It's going to solve disease. It's going to solve injustice. It might even solve death. There's quite a lot of people saying that death is really just a performance failure, and it's a technological problem, and that we have to apply technology to it. And so the boosters say, really, in the end, technology is going to solve our problems, and we're going to have to really just get out of the way. People who are upset about technology, your Luddite types, you get out of the way, because that's the route to a better human future. The knockers, this is Charles Taylor's term, the knockers of technology, however, have a whole list of problems, they say. And actually, Derek only talked about one of the problems that people fear. What are they? Well, for example, according to Charles Taylor, technology, the critics say, cuts us off from the earth, cuts us off from each other, and cuts us off from ourselves. So when it cuts us off, I'm just kind of semi-quoting, paraphrasing him. First, we've lost contact with the earth, with its rhythms that our ancestors were in touch with. So, for example, the mobility of technological society breaks our bonds to any particular place and geography. Global capitalism means that you have economic inequality, we have loss of jobs, or somebody once said that capitalism always produces high-paying jobs, middle-paying jobs, and low-paying jobs. But it used to be, until you had increased technology, they were always in the same country, even sometimes in the same county, even sometimes in the same city. But because of globalization through technology, now the problem is it's distributed across the face of the world, but you could have a country in which there was nothing but low-paying jobs, or a country in which is almost like nothing but middle-paying jobs. And so it leads to income equality in any particular place. It leads to the loss of work in all these sorts of ways. Also, many people would say technology looks at the natural environment as just raw material for us to be using for our own happiness and our own interests, and so it leads to climate change. And so in all sorts of ways, technology cuts us off from the earth. Secondly, it cuts us off from each other. Read Sherry Turkle's stuff about being alone together, how in all sorts of ways social media and technology has basically diminished the need for face-to-face relationships, which actually makes all relationships thinner. It's also true that in some ways it depersonalizes all human institutions. Whenever my wife Kathy calls any bank, calls any company, calls any store, as soon as it sounds like someone's beginning to answer, as soon as she hears a click, she says, "I want to talk to a person." And the fact is, it's not efficient. It's not technologically and economically efficient to have real people answering the phone. And as a result, you just have the depersonalization. Thirdly, critics of technology say we can't accept, not only do we lose contact with the earth and with each other, but with ourselves, in that technology leads us to think there's no givenness to our natural being. There's no, that technology can overcome anything about us that we don't like, even death. And there's really no human nature. There's nothing about us that makes us, there's no given, to use Marilyn Robinson's term, there's no givenness to us. We can just somehow use technology to change absolutely anything we want. in which case we're kind of cut off from everything. The boosters, of course, say, get out of the way. All that stuff is just going to keep us from progress. Now, what Charles Taylor does, I think, is something that I think is really very compelling, especially if he could write it in more accessible language. It would be very compelling. But he is a philosopher. He'd lose his job, if he was accessible. He would, actually. But here's the point. He says, and I think right off the bat, everybody would say, I think most people would say, the boosters and the knockers are extreme. But he says, you don't want to go in the middle, as if, let's just use a little bit of technology. That's not the issue. In fact, you can't just use a little bit of technology. Technology is like a Lay's potato chip. I guess I'm showing my age. You can only eat one. You can't eat only one. What was it? What was the commercial? Oh, so you're old too. Huh? I see. I hear you. However, here's what he says. What you need is this. Technology needs we need retrieval of the moral sources that originally gave rise to technological advance in Western society, but which have gone away. Very interesting. He says, we don't just there's no way to arbitrarily just say, well, let's have a little bit of technology, but too much. You're going to have to do retrieval. What does that mean? It's fascinating. First of all, here's what he means. He says, technology without moral sources and without moral guidance becomes an end in itself. And the main problem with technology today is everything, the logic of technology, which is cost-benefit efficiency, is being applied to absolutely everything, including your personal relationships, including marriage. Everything is done on the basis of cost-benefit. Everything is done on the basis of efficiency. Am I getting more out of it than I'm putting in? If not, cut my losses and go. And so the technology becomes an end in itself when efficiency and profitability becomes the ultimate end. And what the bottom line of what Taylor is saying is simply this. Scientific technology can tell you the most efficient way to do something, but it cannot tell you whether you should do it. It cannot generate its own moral sources. It cannot in any way, it can tell you what's the best way to do something, but never whether you should do it or not. Now, some people, including the technological boosters, would say that's not true. That's actually not true. Technology can certainly develop its own moral sources. You don't need to bring something in from outside. Why not? They say, for example, we can determine through big data, excuse me here, I think I get it again. We can determine through big data what will make most people happy. And we know that people don't thrive in these situations, and they say they're unhappy, and they're down and depressed, and they thrive in these situations. You could make a case to say, well, technology can show that people need to work because psychology shows that they're unhappy. Okay, but here's the problem. What if, let's just say, okay, so maybe technology can determine what people say will make them happy. But what if most people in a culture say they'd be happiest if a particular minority group was eliminated from their society? What if 90% of the people in a society say, I would be much happier if the 10% of the people were just shipped away or destroyed in some way? Would you say, oh, fine, then of course let's use technology to do that? Well, no, we wouldn't want to do that. Why not? Why not? How are you empirically, all you can do with technology is determine what makes people happy, not whether what makes them happy is right. You can't do that. No, you can't. Somebody says, well, okay, but what about if I could prove, and I've had people say this to me, I can prove rationally that oppressing minorities is bad for the economy. That when you get into that, you don't have a prosperous economy. Everybody is lost. Everybody is hurt. If all you're really doing then is saying that oppressing people is impractical, and only in terms of one arbitrarily selected factor, which is the economy, as if that's really the meaning of human life? See, in the end, the only way you're going to keep technology from just saying anything that we can do efficiently, we should do. If we can do it, we ought to do it. And that's what technology without moral guidance is going to do. and here's the most efficient way to do it. Instead, what we're going to have to actually come back and say, no, as soon as you start talking about human goods, things that are really good for human beings, you're into an area, let's call it faith and values. These are not things that science or technology can determine. They just can't. Jürgen Habermas, a very, very prominent German philosopher, now in his late 80s, in the last 10 years or so, he's been shocking people. He's a secular, German philosopher. He's like the last of the old Frankfurt school. And yet, in the last 10 years, he's been talking about how we do need religion in public discourse. And you know one of the reasons why? This is what he says. He says, science and technology cannot actually define, he calls it, quote unquote, the substance of the human. Technology cannot define what's right or wrong. Basically, he says the same thing as Taylor. In fact, for all I know, Taylor got it from Habermas, so it's about the same age. What they're both saying is technology can tell you the most efficient way to do something, but can never tell you whether it's a good or bad thing to do. It has no ability to regulate itself at all. And in fact, Habermas is old enough to say, and it's pretty scary what he says, look, listen, Nazism and Stalinism were both, with all their enormous genocides, were both basically movements of technology. They were practical ways of reaching the ends that the majority of people said they wanted. But there was no guidance, there was no moral guidance for it. And here's another quote by another thinker, quote, "Science, technology, is a magnificent material force, but it is not a teacher of morals. It can perfect machinery, but it adds no moral restraints to protect society from the misuse of the machine. Science does not and cannot teach brotherly love." Now, back to Taylor. Well, what are we going to do about this? And Taylor, this is what's so fascinating. Taylor and Habermas, they kind of do the same thing. They're not preachers, though Habermas is a secular man and Charles Taylor is a French-Canadian Catholic, pretty liberal Catholic, but he's Catholic. And but they both do the very same thing. And they say, historically, Western technology advanced so fast, it advanced much faster than technology and science advanced in the East or in other parts of the world. Western technology advanced. Why? Let's go back and see why it originally advanced. And this is from Taylor. It's quite interesting. Taylor said that both the medieval church, medieval European culture, and Eastern culture had a view that this material life, was not the real world. That there was a sacred order in some ways that was more real than this world. Now, and Taylor says, the Greeks and the Romans, if you were a Platonist who believed and there was a realm of ideas, if you were a Stoic, you believed in the Logos, this world was actually a kind of shadow world, not as real as the eternal world. Don't forget that most Eastern religions believe that the physical world is actually an illusion. And the medieval Catholic culture of Europe basically saw the sacred order in heaven as a more real place in some ways. So that if you were a peasant or if you were poor, hey, the main thing is just live a good life and go to heaven. That's the real world. And Taylor says it was the Renaissance and the Reformation, combination of the Renaissance and the Reformation, that in the West created a sense that this world, this material world, ordinary life, was extraordinarily important. And Taylor, again, partly being a Catholic, says the reason is because what Judaism and Christianity, which means the Older and the New Testament, the Hebrew and the Greek scriptures, said about human nature. One is that God created this world as an act of love. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the work of a demiurge, or it wasn't the work of in other words, it wasn't an afterthought. He created the world. Secondly, all human beings are made in the image of God, so we all reflect God, and every single human being is of infinite worth. Thirdly, the Son of God got a body and came to earth and died and rose from the dead. And the ultimate salvation that both you see, Judaism is a little bit more vague in the Old Testament, but it's much more explicit in the New Testament in Christianity. The coming world is a new material world, a renewed material world. The ultimate salvation of Christianity is not a non-material world in heaven forever. It's a renewed material universe here. Jesus Christ had a body, and he was the firstborn of the new creation. And he eats a fish, and you can feel the holes in his fingers, in his hands, and that's our future. And as Taylor said, there had never been a worldview in history that took this material world so absolutely seriously. And every human being in this material world was so important. And he says that fueled technological advance. Now here's what's ironic. Taylor says, if you think that this world is not the real world, technology has no motivation. Why make the world better for everybody? Why deal with hunger and poverty? Why try to make the world a better place for ordinary life? So if this world is not the real world, then there's no motivation for technology. But if this world is the only real world, if there's no moral absolutes, if nature is not a gift of God to us that we're supposed to take care of, it's a sacred trust that we can't do anything we want with, then suddenly it just becomes raw material that we can just chop up any way we want. You know, it's not just that God gives the world to the human race to say, take care of this. You are stewards of this. This is not yours to do anything you want with. You have to honor it. You have to develop it. Yes, you have to cultivate it, but you also have to honor it. You know, there's places in the Old Testament where God says, he says to soldiers, if you're going to attack another city, don't hurt the trees. Are you at war with the trees? He says, you know, why in the world would you destroy trees? They're part of the creation. There's places in the book of Proverbs that says one of the ways you can tell a godly person is they're good to their animals. Why? The animals are not theirs to do anything they want with. This sense of the sacredness of the world, because there's another world from which God created this world, is crucial to put moral limits and put moral sources around technology. So got that? If this world is the only world, no moral sources. Habermas and Taylor are right. Technology, run amok. If this world isn't the real world, then there's really no reason to try to make it a better place. What can Christians do? Christians, and I'm speaking to those, I mean, this is a faith and work conference, right, David? So those of you with faith, not all of you may have faith in Christianity or God, but those of you who are here with it, just say this. Number one, I think that we need to find ways of joining with people like Taylor and Habermas in their critique of the technological society. Not being a booster or a knocker, but trying to retrieve those moral sources and trying to show our friends around us who may not have the same faith that frankly, technology does need some kind of moral source. It can't generate its own moral sources. It can't generate its own limits from within. So we have to do that. But it's more important that we actually show the world how not to either, you might say, demonize technology or abuse it. And the main way to do that is this. The Bible says to believers this: idolatry is always a problem for every human being and always a danger. Isaiah is constantly talking about you make an idol out of wood using your craftsmanship technology. You make an idol out of metal using your craftsmanship technology. Then you bow down to it and say, save me. You made it, and you say, save me. And you say, when you read it, you say, boy, that is pretty stupid. Who would do that? Well, interesting. We would. We do. As soon as you looked at technology to do for the human race what only God can do, it will become a demon. It will eat you. It will run amok. There will be all kinds of counterintuitive ways in which it backfires on you. Because it's only a tool. It's not itself something that can save us. Daniel chapter 4:30, that's where Nebuchadnezzar is looking at this incredible Babylon which he's built, and the great emperor, and he says, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the might of my power and the glory of my majesty? He's basically saying, look at the technology, look at the buildings, look at the architecture, look what I've done. And at that point, of course, God strikes him down with insanity for a number of years to humble him. And yet, that's where, to some degree, we may be going. At least some people are going there. Hey, Christians know this. The reason why we're tempted to, in a sense, worship the work of our hands, look to the work of our hands to give us significance. Say, I want to do that. Why? Just because it gives me a sense of power that I did that, I can do that, we can do that. Comes from an inner emptiness. Jesus Christ says, in me, you are significant, not because of your performance, but because of my performance. Christianity gives you an identity which is not achieved but it received. And then that makes work just work. Not a means of significance, not a means by which I have changed the world. It makes work just works, a way to serve people, not a way to get an identity. And then it makes it much more difficult, but not impossible, for Christians to abuse technology. Christians ought to be good models, and Christians ought to join with anybody who critiques technology without moral guidance. In all these ways, I think we can actually make the world a considerably better place through technology, which originally was what God wanted us to do. Thank you.